just when you thought we were recovering financially from the pandemic.
I always say tariffs is the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary. Because tariffs are going to make us rich as hell. It's going to bring our country's businesses back that left us.
But how much damage can one man do, even if he is the US president?
So what you are saying is that an economic downturn comparable to the Great Depression of the 1930s is not inconceivable.
Certainly it's not inconceivable.
This could be a long, hard battle, and the impact that will have on economies around the world, the global economy, is not going to be good.
President Trump's tariffs are continuing to send shockwaves and fuel fears of a recession. Now,
some are even worried that the global economy could fall into a recession.
It's not overstating it to say it's carnage or a bloodbath.
You're hearing the drumbeat get louder and louder about a recession.
A possible recession, the probability of a recession.
The threat of a recession. It's a real threat.
Some economists say it's likely already here.
I'm 100% sure that we are in a recession. The only question for me now is how deep and how long.
It's been weeks of bad economic news, tariffs, trade wars, and the rising possibility of a global recession.
Goldman Sachs today increased the chances of a US recession to 45% this year.
We still have the recession risk, even with this 90-day pause, at about 60%.
Some economists have put their predictions of a US recession this year at a probability of 90%. And of course, when the US economy is in trouble, we all feel it.
Now to the New Zealand economy. An economic forecast for 2026 is looking pretty tough. The latest Infometrics forecast predicts a 1.4% decline in New Zealand's expected GDP growth in 2026. Unsurprisingly, the main drivers in the slowdown are the emerging international trade war issues.
The coalition government has sought to reassure New Zealanders that it has the economy in hand as the United States' radical tariff regime risks a global recession.
We have seen a profound shift in the global economic landscape.
It is clear we are witnessing a historically significant global economic event.
I mean, it will impact us to some extent, there's no doubt. I mean, we don't trade with the US as much as some other countries, but it's 25% of the global economy. It's a huge part of global activity. So if the US is slowing down or entering recession, the impacts will be relatively widespread.
I'm Gwen McClure, and today on The Detail, what does all this mean for New Zealand? Are we headed into a recession? And if so, how bad will it get? Mike Jones is chief economist at the BNZ. I asked him to start by defining a recession.
Well, a technical definition of a recession is 2 quarters in a row of negative or falling economic growth. That's probably the most common way people define it, but a broader definition can be more useful as well. Basically, a prolonged period of weak economic conditions. Now, I think that the most recent period in the economy is quite instructive. We had a technical recession in the middle of last year, but part of the reason it hit so hard, I think, is that it came on top of basically 2 years worth of recessionary conditions where we didn't have a lot of growth at all.
So there's a lot of talk right now about how we're headed into another recession, or likely, I should say, headed into another recession. And I think a lot of that talk feels scarier than what happened mid last year. Why is that, do you think?
Well, I think the first point is that if you take stock of where we are now as an economy, I mean, we're barely out of recession. We've only had 1 quarter of positive growth after 2 years of not a lot of growth at all. And many of the impacts of last year's recession are still with us. Things like rising unemployment, rising business insolvencies, some financial stress in some areas. So we've really only scraped off the bottom of the business cycle, and that leaves us a little bit vulnerable. I don't think at this stage that we're necessarily destined for recession. I think that the scary bit is that we're seeing this big global shock kind of play out on our screens and in the media on a daily or intradaily basis, which has the potential, certainly, to knock some of the growth potential from New Zealand's economy. Now, I think the question is probably not so much, does that big trade shock immediately push us back into recession? It's more, does it kind of take the top off the recovery just when things were starting to get going again? Because we have seen actually in the more recent economic numbers some better news. There's a bit of forward momentum coming through. But in talking to businesses, they're worried again because They were just starting to emerge and get some momentum, and maybe that's at risk now.
The buzzwords that are getting used a lot are tariffs and trade war. Can you explain to me how this actually plays out and how those things actually lead to, if not a recession, an economic downturn?
Yeah, there's probably two particularly important channels in this case. The first is via trade and exports. We are an exporting country. We rely on the global economy, I suppose, is our shop floor where we sell our wares as a nation. We derive about 20% of our output from exports. So as a result of this trade shock, if we see growth in our trading partners and China in particular slow dramatically, then maybe they're less inclined to buy some of our exports, or maybe they're forced to buy it at a lower price, or in some cases not at all. So that's, I suppose, the first channel. The second would be via a hit to confidence. So an example of that would be consumers reading the news, getting concerned about the economy, maybe checking your KiwiSaver balance, getting a bit of a fright. All of the things that might cause people just to hold back on spending or hit pause. And for businesses, it's probably similar. Do firms pause expansion plans or capex plans or employment plans until the dust starts to settle a little bit? And the real killer there is I think at the moment, the uncertainty. We're not really sure how this all ends or even when. We're seeing things change on a near daily or sometimes intraday basis. And so when firms are uncertain about the outlook, they just tend to sit on their hands. They tend to do nothing. And doing nothing, of course, is in of itself negative for economic activity. It's activity that might have otherwise occurred that may no longer occur. So that's a hit to economic growth.
So basically, I read the news. I'm worried about what's going to happen. I start squirreling away my extra cash. If I own a business, I maybe don't hire the people I was planning on hiring. It's almost psychological. It's a people panic and they don't spend, businesses don't hire, and that creates the downturn.
Yeah, that's certainly part of it. Look, part of it is a fundamental shifts in the global growth outlook, which obviously matter for our exports. But the other part is the confidence impact. It's, do people just pull their horns in, start squirreling away a bit more than they otherwise, or for firms maybe just pausing on some plans that were ready to go ahead, growth or capex plans, until they hopefully get a bit more certainty. The issue at the moment, of course, is no one really knows when we might get that certainty. And so it's a prolonged period of uncertainty that we're staring down, which undermines the growth potential of the country, yeah.
And some of the supports for the economy, like immigration, aren't there right now.
Tens of thousands of Kiwis packed their bags and jetted off to live overseas in 2024. According to the latest Stats NZ figures, there was a provisional net migration loss of just over 47,000 New Zealand citizens last year.
Immigration is an important part of the picture, particularly in New Zealand. At the simplest level, more people in the country means more economic activity. You've got high population growth, there's more people moving about, requiring housing, entertainment, food, transport, all of that stuff contributes to the economy, of course. So over the past year or so, we've seen migration or the migration-led population boom deflate quite rapidly, both through New Zealand citizens leaving permanently and the number of new migrants arriving forward. It's still positive, but fewer people are turning up on our shores. So I think that, or the loss of that population growth, it has been the equivalent of sort of kicking a leg of support out from under the economy, probably did contribute to the recessionary conditions we saw late last year, and also probably just exposed what has been quite a low level of underlying growth in New Zealand. If you're getting more people turn up, you're getting that population boom we had a couple of years ago, it does sort of paper over some of the cracks in the economy. But when that tide goes out, it does expose what has been quite a weak level of underlying economic growth in New Zealand.
Let's look at the U.S. for a moment, because that's sort of where all this is starting. Is there a consensus amongst economists that they are headed toward a recession?
Well, look, I don't think there's much of a consensus on anything at the moment, but I think it is relatively clear the U.S. economy is going to take a hit, and the odds of recession have gone up a lot. Whether it's a full-blown recession or whether it's just lower growth is probably beside the point. it wasn't that long ago, maybe a couple of months, that the US had one of the strongest economies around. And what we're seeing now on a near daily basis is some really big and worrying falls in things like consumer sentiment, firms' hiring plans, firms' capex plans in the US. I think probably, though, for the average American, the thing that's really starting to worry them is the fact that inflation is showing signs of rearing its head again. I mean, just like in New Zealand, people are over it. The last thing anyone wants is another bout of price hikes. But tariffs are essentially a tax on consumers. And now you're starting to see in the US all of these estimates flying around about the higher cost consumers will be paying there for, in particular, Chinese imports. So things like iPhones, electronics, furniture, all of the sorts of stuff that the US imports from China.
We've been hearing from several Chinese companies who've told us that their products are stuck in ports here, waiting to go to the United States. The tariffs are simply too high for US buyers to afford them.
So it's those inflation worries that are probably top of mind, but you put it together, you're getting lower growth, you're getting higher inflation. It's what economists would call stagflation, which is essentially the worst of both worlds.
Well, and obviously these tariffs have been on and off and on and off and paused for 90 days and maybe not electronics. And, it's kind of been all over the show. But even if Trump were to say, forget it, I'm not going to do my tariff plan as I was, is it sort of too late? I mean, has confidence just been knocked enough that they're on the path and it's too late to stop?
Yeah, look, it probably is. I mean, there are things in train now that are pretty difficult to unwind, even if we did, as you said, just sort of suddenly kind of forget about the whole thing, or the whole thing was unwound, particularly the corrosive impact of that uncertainty that we've seen to date. I mean, there is already activity in the US that's been cancelled as a result of this sort of flip-flopping on tariffs. There's also probably as well the question of, well, even if we saw some rowing back or further rowing back in some of the announcements, well, what's to say that might not change in future? So I think countries and other countries and some companies are probably going to think about changing their supply chains or rejigging their supply chains to try and exclude the US or ameliorate the impact of any additional US tariffs anyway, because the US is perhaps not as a reliable trading partner as we might have thought.
How possible is it, though, for any country, and I suppose specifically New Zealand, to untangle ourselves from the US? I mean, if they're headed into a recession or into, economic nuclear winter, I think someone called it, are we sort of bound to get dragged along to some extent?
I mean, it will impact us to some extent, there's no doubt. I mean, we don't trade with the US as much as some other countries, but it's 25% of the global economy. It's a huge part of global activity. So if the US is slowing down or entering recession, the impacts will be relatively widespread. Probably more relevant for us now is China, though. We export about, or China takes about 25% of our exports as opposed to 13% that go to the US. So, I think a significant turn down in Chinese economic growth would make things particularly difficult for New Zealand.
So if these high tariffs remain in place for China importing into the US, that will impact China and therefore us.
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, at last count, and these things are changing obviously, but the tariff rates were upwards of 100%, into the 150s, which is essentially a block on trade. I mean, business or trade just sort of doesn't happen at those sorts of levels. So what you're talking about is the world's largest two economies ceasing trading with each other, which will have a huge impact on the global economy and New Zealand. I mean, about half of all of our trading activity, if you tally up exports, imports, goods and services, about half of all of that happens with either the US or China. So we have become more exposed to those two big powerhouses over time, and we've tended to trade less with some of the other parts of the world like Europe and the UK. So yeah, we are, of course, exposed.
Let's talk about some of the things that the world and governments around the world can do to, if not recession-proof themselves, kind of try to protect themselves a bit. What are some of the tricks that are out there?
Yeah, I mean, there's some cushions. I mean, that we can, or governments or central banks can use to soften the impact. I mean, those institutions would say, well, that they're not fixals. You can't address a global trade shock with fiscal and monetary policy, but you can provide a bit of a cushion. And so the first cab, I think, will be central banks. So in our case, that's the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. I mean, it's the Reserve Bank's job to manage the ups and downs of the business cycle, and it generally does that with interest rates. Obviously, interest rate cuts in New Zealand are well underway already.
The silver lining is mortgage rates have further to fall. That is the message from some economists as the Reserve Bank cut the official cash rate by 25 basis points today. It was a move that was widely predicted, but comes amid enormous economic upheaval.
So we've got some of that cash flow impact flowing back into households' pockets, over the next wee while from lower mortgage rates as people refix onto those lower levels. And look, the Reserve Bank could just say, well, okay, we were cutting rates, but maybe if this thing worsens, then we might just cut rates a little bit more than we otherwise would have, just to provide a bit of that extra cushion. For the government, there's what economists would call the automatic stabilisers, which all sounds very reassuring. The idea is that if an economy turns down, well, the government tends to take in less tax as incomes and profits come down, and tends to pay out a little bit more in benefits for unemployment and other things like that. So the government kind of automatically takes a bit less cash out of the economy during times when it needs some support. You've also got, I guess, in the back room somewhere, the full-blown crisis stuff, the sorts of things that are a bit more imaginative that we saw, for example, rolled out during some parts of the COVID shock. And those are tools that are very much the sort of break glass in case of emergency type area, because as we've seen, there are clear and often lasting costs to using those. So we're not, anticipating or anywhere near those sorts of levels just yet, but they are there as an option for countries addressing global growth shocks as well.
Tell me about those.
So that's things like, as we saw in COVID, central banks printing money or quantitative easing, lending directly to banks, committing to keep interest rates low for a long period of time, and on the government side, very direct fiscal support, sort of pushing money out into the economy very quickly. All of those things to varying extents we saw employed in the pandemic.
So a lot of these measures that we're talking about, the point is to get people spending and get that money coming back into the economy, right?
Yeah.
So as an individual, if I think, okay, we're headed into a recession, I'm starting to save my extras. I'm trying not to spend. But that's actually the opposite of what we need to do as a society to avoid a recession. Is that right?
Yeah, in some sense, that's right. I mean, I think we've seen both consumers and businesses play things from the conservative side over the past couple of years, quite rightly, because people are worried about the outlook. So you save a bit more money, you trim expenses, you pay down a bit of debt, not panicking, kind of move those levers that are available to you. And that's, as I say, in some ways why we've been in this fragile sort of recovery. I think it probably does mean, though, that we're in probably a relatively good place in terms of where we are now to tackle any sort of shock that comes along. People are getting used to it. We've had quite a few of them in the last few years.
How is our government in terms of debt? Can we as a country afford a recession?
Well, look, any sort of knock to the growth prospects of the country is clearly unhelpful. It's not helpful in terms of the government's books. But I think there's a couple of points here. I mean, first, as we've discussed, I mean, anytime you get a nasty macro shock, it's normally the Reserve Bank. In the first instance, that's best placed to respond with lowering interest rates more than they otherwise might have. And we actually saw the Minister for Finance quite recently set that out quite clearly, saying there's no real intention to change course on the government's fiscal strategy. And Treasury said, yep.
We've previously said that we want to consolidate gradually. Our goal is to get back into surplus by the 27-28 financial year. That goal remains the same.
Okay, so we get back to surplus 27-28 and then we start hammering the debt. Is that right?
That's right, because once you're in surplus, of course, you're no longer borrowing to pay for the groceries and you've got the ability to pay down debt. Of course, we're borrowing every day right now to keep our hospitals, schools and police going, but we can't do that forever as a country. We need to get the books back in balance.
There is room, if things really did go south, for a change in that fiscal strategy, and there is room to do so. Government debt is a bit higher than the government would like. It's about 42% of GDP. target is, I think, 40% or below. So there's some room there, I guess, in particular, given where other countries are, which is quite a lot higher than that. But look, at the point that we're at now, I think it would probably be in the first instance over to the central bank to provide that cushion should things worsen on the trade front.
ANZ's economists are predicting that the OCR will have to drop to 2.5%. Do you agree with that?
Well, that's pretty close to our own forecast, actually. We've been forecasting the official cash rate to drop to 2.75% for quite some time, actually. So it's a little bit lower than us, but kind of same ballpark, and speaks to the same risks as we see them, which is, number one, the economic recovery that we've been in is fragile and probably proceeding at a slightly slower pace than we might have hoped. I think we're probably still in first gear. We hoped we might have been in second or third by now. So we are in the slow and low growth environment, number one. And number two, we've had this shock come along. No one's really sure of the impact just yet, but we know that impact is most likely going to be negative in some sort of fashion. So there is a case to take the cash rate or interest rates a bit lower than otherwise.
In terms of the effect on people, what's sort of the worst case scenario of a recession? Is it unemployment?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, that's where recession rubber hits the road typically is the labour market. So whether it's loss of a job or loss of a job opportunity or loss of income, that is the really big nasty impact that low or slow or negative economic growth can have. And we've seen in the last couple of years unemployment rise from quite low levels, 3% odd, up to shade over 5% in terms of where it is now. Now, our view's been that trend for higher unemployment's probably got a little further to go, closer to 5.5% than the 5% where we are now. We haven't really changed that just yet. But look, the risk is if again, we're all talking in sort of if, buts and maybes, but should the outlook worsen, then you would expect that to bring with it a weaker picture for the labour market.
Is a recession a good time for anything? I mean, is there anything positive that comes out of one?
It's a good question. I think, look, if you try hard enough, you can probably come up with some silver linings.
Probably in anything, I
inflation,
suppose. But
I mean, we all would like a bit more good news. Look, you normally see inflation come down in a recession. You might be able to borrow at a lower interest rate. We just talked about lower interest rates. Or you might be able to buy a house or some shares at a sort of cheaper level than otherwise. I think for me, though, it's kind of hard to look at any of those things as good in isolation because the very reason they're occurring is because growth prospects for the country are being negatively reassessed. Asset prices fall generally because earnings associated with those assets are lower, interest rates fall to buffer the bigger negatives hitting the economy, and inflation falls because firms basically have to absorb a bit more cost into their margins. So I kind of hate to be the Grinch, but there's just not much to like about low or negative economic growth.
Yeah.
From what we're seeing just now, we think there's probably enough positives coming through to keep that recovering momentum going in the economy in the short term. So the nasty stuff we're looking at around the trade shock is more a question of the sustainability of the recovery rather than something that's going to immediately plunge us back into recession. It's probably a bit different in the US as we talked about, where it's looking more likely there. But then again, the US is coming from a much stronger position than us. I mean, we've had 2 years of recessionary type growth where the US has actually had a relatively strong economy. So I think that starting point matters as well.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was produced by Alexi Russell and engineered by Jeremy Ansell. Thanks to the BNZ's chief economist, Mike Jones. I'm Gwen McClure. Ka kite.